It is the Banner Ravens podcast. Paul Mancano and Jonas Shaffer live on a Monday in January. We are still reacting to the fact that Jesse Minter is the next head coach, the fourth head coach in Baltimore Ravens history. We have some more thoughts on his hiring. We're going to talk about whom he could hire as coordinators as well, some names that have popped up there. And he has made a hire to his staff. He has hired an assistant, his very first. We'll talk about who that is and why he is joining Jesse Minter's staff. And then we'll be joined by tape grinder, defensive guru, Cody Alexander, to break down what makes a Jesse Minter defense special. All that and much, much more. But first, let's get a quick word from our sponsor.
For the fifth year in a row, Toyota is the best resale value brand according to Kelley Blue Book's KBB.com, including the 2025 Grand Highlander, best in resale value for midsize SUVs. Toyota, let's go places.
All right, Jonas, we are going to dive more into the hiring of Jesse Minter and what his defense, what his staff could look like in Baltimore. But first, we do have a review that we have to read out, because if you write us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, I will read it out here on the show. This one comes from Super Bowl 47 Champs. He says, obviously the best Ravens podcast. Paul and Jonas are the perfect pairing. Always great analysis, great banter, no agenda, unlike some of the other Ravens podcasts. Wouldn't expect anything less, I should say, from professional journalists. Great job, lads. Keep the great content coming. He called us lads. That's very nice. Jonas, let's dive into Jesse Minter, because it's been 4 days since Jesse Minter has been hired as the Ravens head coach. We've gotten a foot of snow in Baltimore. In the meantime, I hope everybody out there is staying warm, has their driveway or their walkway shoveled, and I hope that they got to enjoy some of the snow if they have kids, perhaps, or just adults that have sleds. In the meantime, also, by the way, Mike Macdonald has reached his first Super Bowl as a head coach, as his Seattle Seahawks punched their ticket to Super Bowl 60. Jonas, wow. In 2 years, could you have imagined that Mike Macdonald would be leading a Sam Darnold quarterbacked team to the Super Bowl in just his second year as the head man?
I could not. Paul, is there a button that I can push that I can get you to explain why Mike Macdonald isn't the Ravens head coach?
Yes, it's because I do this every single time, because the outrage from fans is never ending. I mean, I guarantee there's still going to be comments on our live stream on YouTube, X, and Facebook that are, we let Mike Macdonald go. This is our fault for letting Mike Macdonald walk out the building.
But why, Paul? Why did it happen?
Jonas, I'll tell you why it happened. It's because you were never going to fire John Harbaugh after the team made the AFC Championship game, and John Harbaugh was not going to walk away or resign. He was going to be coming back no matter what. You couldn't have convinced Mike Macdonald to stay on as defensive coordinator. He was going to take that first head coaching job. It's just amazing that he's been able to do this so quickly. I think we figured, any one of these guys is a gamble. Jesse Minter is as much a gamble as anybody else. Mike Macdonald was a great defensive coordinator, but being a head coach, it takes something different. Not all of these guys are able to make the leap. Josh McDaniels is the best example on the other side of this Super Bowl matchup of somebody who is an awesome coordinator but can't take the leap to being a good NFL head coach. Kudos to Mike Macdonald. He has built a culture pretty quickly and easily there in Seattle, and to do this with a career journeyman in Sam Darnold as his quarterback is incredibly impressive.
Yeah, I think there are object lessons for the Ravens on both sides of the ball with both teams. Like with the Chargers, I think I read that 7 or 8 of the 11 regular starters for the Seahawks defense were starters 2 years ago before Mike Macdonald took over. So it has not been a huge revamping of the Seahawks defense to get them to be one of the best defenses in recent modern NFL history. Obviously, Nicky Manwari was a huge addition. Byron Murphy in the middle there has been great and really helping to help this Chargers defense play the way that it wants to play. A lot of too high, a lot of light boxes, and just forcing teams to kind of play the way the Chargers want them to play, the way that Mike Macdonald wants them to play. But it has not been a teardown in Seattle. It has been just a building on what already existed there. And what already existed there was a lot of good pieces. And you could say there are a lot of good pieces in Baltimore. It's just a matter of getting them all to fit together, maybe improving the teaching of whatever system the Ravens are going to be doing, are going to be implementing. over this next year. And then with the Patriots, like you look at that Patriots offense, I think, top two, top three in EPA per play. Obviously has not faced a gauntlet of defenses, at least during the regular season, but not overwhelming, talent on the offensive line, not overwhelming talent at the skill positions, but you have a great force multiplier quarterback in Drake May, who's knows where to go to the ball, who does a good job of limiting turnovers, and here they are, one win away from the Super Bowl. So who knows if Jesse Minter has it in him to do the kind of turnaround that Mike Vrabel did in just 1 year. I don't know if they're going to face as accommodating a schedule or as accommodating a division as the Patriots got this year. But every single year there are incredible turnarounds for first-time head coaches. If it wasn't Mike Vrabel, it'd be Liam Cohen. That there are just so many opportunities to turn things around quickly and effectively. And I think it would be silly to discount what the Ravens limitations were this year, because it doesn't take a whole lot to get in a new staff, the new vision, new teachers, new players, certainly with the amount of draft picks the Ravens have this year, and have the opportunity to turn this team around into one of the NFL's best in short order.
The flip side of that coin is maybe there's more pressure now for these new head coaches to succeed immediately, because we've seen so many turnarounds in the NFL this past year from guys who were either on their first head coaching job or their first year with a new team. Vrabel's first year with the Patriots, Mike Macdonald's second year with the Seattle Seahawks. Liam Cohen obviously did a great job with the Jaguars, turning that team around very quickly. You see these success cases around the NFL, and I just hope it doesn't make Steve Bisciotti even more impatient. To have some kind of impatience is good, because you don't want this window to slam shut while you're waiting for Jesse Minter to grow as a head coach. But also, Jesse Minter, if it wasn't already abundantly clear, is walking into a pressure-filled situation here in Baltimore, because the pressure is on him and on this team to win early. Let's talk more about our thoughts since Jesse Minter has been hired, because we had Chris Rim of ESPN on our podcast last time. He gave us kind of great insight into who Jesse Minter is, what kind of defensive coordinator he was in LA. And Jonas, you said near the end of that podcast that your concern is the Ravens had the best head coaching opening in the market, even with the Bills opening. They had the best head coaching opening maybe of the last 3 or 4 years. This was a perfect situation for a new head coach to walk into. With the added pressure, sure, but you have all of the pieces there, and you have an MVP level quarterback where you could take this team over the hump very quickly. You see the opposite of it in Cleveland, where everybody and their mother is backing out of a head coaching offer from that team because they just don't want to coach there. Everybody in the world, every coach should want to coach this Ravens team. And so you should have your pick of the litter. And Jesse Minter is uniquely qualified. He certainly brings a lot to the table. But your concern, Jonas, was, did the Ravens miss an opportunity to find the next Sean McVay, to find the next brilliant offensive mind that is out there? Have you changed your mind at all about that, or are you still kind of have that lingering concern in the back of your mind?
I think that is always going to be just part of the calculus here, just because of what we're dealing with Lamar in terms of how long can he realistically play the way that he has been playing and be a top 3 quarterback, top 5 quarterback, whatever you want to, whatever bucket you want to put him in. But you look at just who made the Super Bowl this year, and Mike Macdonald is a defensive-minded coach. Mike Vrabel played defense for the Patriots, and the one thing through all the interviews that Gianna and I have been doing for the Jesse Minter story that we're working on is just the way that he connects with guys. And you see Stephon Diggs get up at the podium and be emotional talking about how Mike Vrabel is the best coach that he's worked with, and Stephon Diggs has been around the block, and he played for a very well-respected coach in Sean McDermott in Buffalo. So the fact that these guys were able to connect with their coaches, and you don't hear a single crossword about Mike Vrabel in New England or about Mike Macdonald in Seattle, that these guys set the expectations pretty early, and it's on you as a player to meet them. And if not, then the guy behind you on the depth chart is going to be getting those reps over you, getting those snaps before you. So I think as much as we talk about X's and O's and just the possibility of hiring a guy who could be at the vanguard of an offensive or defensive revolution. And you could say that Jesse Minter is definitely up there in terms of the great young hot shot coordinators. At a certain point, football just comes down to, like, do you respect the guy who's coaching you up? Do you respect the guy who's leading you into battle every fall Sunday? And it seems like, just from so many of these guys who've worked with Jesse, from his days as a college coach to an NFL assistant coach to a Michigan Vanderbilt defensive coordinator to now LA, they just really respond to him. And the amount and the outpouring of support that Jesse Minter got as he was leaving LA for the Rams, I think stands in stark contrast to the relatively muted reaction to John Harbaugh getting the boot in Baltimore. Like, you saw a couple guys on Twitter or on their Instagram stories like saying, "We'll miss you, coach," but it really wasn't a whole lot of outcry about this guy, getting the short end of the stick. It was like, okay, this is what's happening. Who's next in line? And I think the fact that Jesse Minter, despite being well out of these guys' age group demographically, was able to connect with them and do a good job and build these long-lasting relationships wherever he's been, bodes well for the kind of buy-in that he'll get in Baltimore.
Yeah, being a leader, being able to connect with players is by far the most important thing. And that was one of the things that John Harbaugh did so well. I mean, sure, maybe by the end it had grown stale, and maybe he wasn't able to connect as well with his players by the end of his tenure, but they hired him as a special teams coach because he had touched every facet of that Eagles roster when he was the special teams coordinator there. And that's what a lot of the players in that organization said. And he came to Baltimore and he did the same thing. He could talk to player 1 and talk to player 52 on the roster, and they all felt like he had their best interest at heart. And that's what the hope is with Jesse Minter, is that he is able to connect with all of these players. And then from an X's and O's standpoint, I mean, it's a copycat league, so maybe the Ravens, we've talked about before, they felt subconsciously some misgivings about letting Mike Macdonald go or missing the opportunity to hire Mike Macdonald, and they chose to get somebody who is very much in the mold of Mike Macdonald. But this Super Bowl matchup may be validating because these are two defensive-minded head coaches. So it goes to show you don't always need an offensive guy. And Sean McVay was on the other sideline in the NFC Championship game for a team that lost. So defensive guys can make it if you have the right infrastructure around there. Jonas, you said last week Lamar Jackson isn't coordinator proof, I should say, because no quarterback is really coordinator proof, but he gives you such a baseline already. And as we will discuss with Cody Alexander, this defense just needs fixing. I mean, it just needs so much, but the talent is there. And so if you can get the defense back to where it was in 2023, if you can get it to that level, you're halfway there. You should be a playoff team automatically just based off that defense. And if Lamar Jackson is healthy, even if the offense isn't humming at 100%. So I feel like that is kind of what they were going for. And one of the things that Steve Bisciotti talked about in his press conference was he's been frustrated with the lack of development from some of these young guys. It's not just on the coaching staff, it's also on the front office. Look at all the guys on defense, these young, talented guys who just were not able to take the next step. I mean, David Ojabo, Odafe Owe, these guys that the Ravens invested high draft picks in, and the talent was certainly there, but they were never able to become star-level players. You had some stars pop here and there, like Nnamdi Madubuike, but now you have this young wave of defensive players that the Ravens have invested high draft picks in. Nate Wiggins, Malachi Starks, TJ Tampa, Mike Green, Teddy Buchanan. Those guys need to have their potential maxed, and they feel like Jesse Minter is the guy that can do that. And if they can do that, I mean, that gets you halfway to where you need to be.
Yeah, and there are analogs for what happened for the kind of guys who popped in LA. Like,
right.
I don't know if we can write in TJ Tampa to a starting cornerback position for 2026, because we don't know what happened with Marlon Humphrey. We don't know if TJ Tampa just doesn't have the athletic pedigree to make it as a outside starting cornerback. But like, Cam Hart is a guy who profiles pretty similarly to TJ Tampa, like a guy who doesn't have great straight line speed, but has a big frame, long arms, was productive around the ball at Notre Dame, like TJ Tampa was at Iowa State. And if Jesse Minter can make it work with with Cam Hart in his early years in LA, then you would think that he would have a pretty good shot of making it work with TJ Tampa as well. The development of Odafe Owe once he got to LA bodes well for Mike Green, who might not have the best athletic profile for defending the run, but was able to come on strong but Odafe was able to come on strong as a pass rusher once he got to the Chargers and make it work there. So it's going to be interesting. Obviously Nate Wiggins is, I think, pretty safely more talented than any of the starting cornerbacks that anchored that very impressive Chargers defense. But is he going to be committed and not committed enough, but is he going to be a guy who is consistent enough to make it work for this Ravens defense? Is he going to be able to adapt to this new Ravens structure, which is not all that different from what Zach Gore was doing, but it's certainly going to be an adjustment for whoever's coming in. So I think it's fair to say that our expectations for the secondary are probably higher for than what they are for this Ravens front, because we just don't know if there's anyone as good as a Khalil Mack or Tulu. Tuli. I'm just going to call him Tuli. Or even like
Pelotu. Yeah.
Thank you. Or even what Odafe turned into by the end of his Chargers tenure. And if you don't have the guys to rush the passer, then that is going to be a problem. Like we saw with San Francisco, Robert Saleh was a respected enough leader of men and coordinator to get the job in Tennessee, but not even he could fix that 49ers pass rush. Like, they made it work to the point that they got a playoff win against the Eagles, but there was just not enough juice up front to be more than like a bottom 5 pass rush group at all. So I think that is going to be the question that's kind of hovering over the early days for Jesse Minter and for Eric DeCosta as he figures out what exactly the plan should be in free agency and the draft, and maybe swinging a trade. If you just don't have the dudes up front to win one-on-ones reliably, like we're going to talk about with Cody, then you're kind of screwed from the very get-go.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about what kind of staff Jesse Minter could assemble in Baltimore, because we don't have too many clues just yet. What we do know is that John Harbaugh is plundering as many Ravens staffers as he possibly can. According to The Athletic, the Giants submitted requests to interview nearly 24 assistants and staffers from the Ravens, and that the expectation is Harbaugh's staff in New York will mostly be filled with former Ravens assistants and a few Giants holdovers. He has hired his defensive coordinator, Denard Wilson, former Ravens staffer. He did not hire Zach Orr. Jonas, were you surprised by that? And do you think that this is maybe a subtle acknowledgement that the Ravens should have promoted Denard Wilson to defensive coordinator 2 years ago before he went off to Tennessee instead of promoting Zach Orr?
It's tough to say. I mean, like, I think we saw that the Ravens had a lot of luck with linebackers coaches being promoted to defensive coordinator. Wink Martindale worked with the linebackers. Mike Macdonald worked with the linebackers. Zach Orr obviously worked with Mike Macdonald and the linebackers. So I think there was an expectation that this guy would have a lot of the same traits. Obviously, it worked in year one. I do want to remind people that, like, there was a successful Ravens defense under Zach Orr. I think, obviously Ravens fan bases, like any other NFL fan base, are quick to turn on guys when it bottoms out, and it did bottom out pretty spectacularly toward the end for the Ravens, especially in that Week 18 against Pittsburgh. But like, there was proof of concept for Zach Orr being able to lead a successful NFL defense, and I don't think this is going to be the last time we're going to see Zach Orr in a play caller role. It wouldn't surprise me if he reunites with Harbs in a lower level, maybe in a positional coach role. Like, he was able to get a lot out of Patrick Queen and Roquan when they were together in Baltimore. And it wasn't just Denard Wilson that he chose him over. It was also Anthony Weaver, who ended up getting the top job for that Miami defense, and is obviously now in the mix for a lot of head coaching interviews. So it could be just that the idea of John Harbaugh and Zach Orr reuniting in New York was unpalatable to the few higher ups on that Giants pecking order, that they just said, you need to hire someone else. And Denard Wilson didn't have a lot of great success leading that Titans defense. It was definitely a Titans defense that had a lot less talent than the Ravens, but it's not like he's bringing in a guy who was seen as the next great up and comer because of what happened in Tennessee these past 2 years. So we'll see how it works. We'll see where Zio lands. You know, I think he's got a great future in this league, but he definitely has some things to fix based on how poorly it went for him in Baltimore over this past year, and then obviously the start to 2024 as well.
Right. So he'll be the defensive coordinator for John Harbaugh. The special teams coordinator for John Harbaugh will be the Ravens' own Chris Horton, hired away. The Ravens were attempting at first, the initial reporting was to block interviews with Chris Horton so that he wouldn't leave the organization. But ultimately, he gets an assistant head coach title added to his resume as well. Do you see this as a massive blow for the Ravens to lose Chris Horton to the Giants?
It's tough to say because I don't know if it would be hard to find a special teams coordinator who had efficiency DVOA scores as high as Chris Horton did. But this is also in Baltimore, a place where they invested in a kicking coach in Randy Brown. And as part of Chris Horton's, success in Baltimore, you had Sam Cook, you had Justin Tucker when he was still being a perennial Pro Bowl selection. So if you had those two, the punt group and the kicking operation, as secure as Chris Horton did, then how much of that was his success? How much of that was John Harbaugh's? How much of that was Randy Brown? How much was that was just the very, very established personnel that you had leading you to a consistent level of success? So it's very, very tough to say that the Ravens are losing like the best special teams coordinator in the NFL. It's a position that is very, very variable, I think, from year to year. And the fact that Chris Horton was able to get this team with John Harbaugh's help to be a perennial top 10 special teams unit by DVOA, I think speaks well of him. Obviously, it was a pretty spectacular failure in 2024 with Justin Tucker not being very good and a lot of the other positional units on that special teams phase also not being very good. I think they rebounded nicely this year to be like 11-12 in DVOA. Again, not what they're used to in Baltimore under John Harbaugh, but still pretty good, all things considered, just considering the injuries that they suffered at that spot. So maybe they can find someone better than Chris Horton, but just judging by his resume and the success year in and year out that he was able to gin up for that group, I guess I would say like kind of set your expectations for what the next guy could do, because this is a volatile position, and losing him doesn't mean that they're going to be able to find, even three guys better than him out there in like the kind of coaching free agency world that we're living in right now.
Yeah. So they lose Chris Horton, but they do make a hire to their defensive staff. Mike Mickens joins Jesse Minter's staff before Jesse Minter even hires a defensive coordinator. He is reportedly hiring Mike Mickens as the defensive backs coach and defensive pass game coordinator. And he was formerly the defensive backs coach at Notre Dame, where he overlapped with Kyle Hamilton. They do have a connection, Minter and Mickens. In 2012, Mickens was a defensive assistant on Minter's staff at Indiana State. He was also a player at Cincinnati when Minter coached there in 2007, 2008. Quite an impressive list of defensive backs that Mike Mickens has worked with over the course of his career. Sauce Gardner, Leonard Moore, Benjamin Morrison, Xavier Watts. This is a guy that has a pretty impressive resume that obviously Minter wanted to add early. He didn't even wait for a defensive coordinator to be in place before he hired Mickens.
Right. And I think probably the best indication that you can get for how excited you should be or not excited you should be about a coach joining your staff is just by gauging the fan base. Like when, not to make it all about me, but when Maryland hired Buzz Williams from Texas A&M, there were Texas A&M fans who were happy to be gone with them. And like, but when the Ravens hired Jesse Minter, there were Chargers fans who were crestfallen to be losing Jesse Minter because of what he'd done with them. And so when the Ravens hired, when the reports came out on Sunday night that Mike Mickens was heading to Baltimore, I went to the college football subreddit and just saw the responses from what I assume were Notre Dame fans. And I think it probably gives you a pretty good gauge for what the Ravens could be getting with Mike Mickens among the comments that stood out on the thread about Mike Mickens to Baltimore. Quote, "My disappointment is immeasurable and my day is ruined." Quote, "The single best position coach I've ever seen at Notre Dame turned corner from a program weakness to pumping out studs. He will be missed." And finally, quote, "The equivalent of Ohio State losing Brian Hartline, who was obviously a wide receivers savant there with the amount of guys that he pumped out there. Jackson Smith and Jigba, obviously Jeremiah Smith is the next one up. So I think you heard similar things about Denard Wilson when he was coming over from Philly to Baltimore, and the degree to which he improved that Ravens defensive backs room with the help of Chris Hewitt, I think cannot be understated. So if they are getting a Denard Wilson level higher, if they're getting someone even better than him, then this could be, in retrospect, like one of the most impactful coaching hires that anyone makes in the NFL at the assistant level.
My only question is, are there too many M names in the coaching
cycle
these days? Mike McDaniel, Josh McDaniels, Mike Macdonald, Jesse Minter, Mike Mickens, Mike McCarthy. There's just a ridiculous number. Paul Mancano. There's a ridiculous number of M names that are getting interviews for coaches.
Do you have a grudge against the Irish, Paul?
I threw in was I the only Italian name that I threw in there? Probably.
You try to sneak yourself in there with all the Macs.
Exactly. All right, let's talk about who the Ravens could hire under Jesse Minter as the coordinators. Offensive coordinator is a massive, massive hire. We talked about it last week that so much of Jesse Minter's success will come down to his offensive staff, and it starts with the offensive coordinator in place. Some names that are out there, not names that have been connected to the Ravens at offensive coordinator. Cliff Kingsbury, former Cardinals head coach, former Commanders offensive coordinator. Joe Brady, Bills offensive coordinator. Matt Nagy, former Bears head coach, former Chiefs offensive coordinator. Davis Webb, Denver Broncos offensive pass game coordinator and QB coach. Nate Scheelhaase, Rams pass game coordinator. And then, of course, T. Martin on the Ravens staff as the quarterbacks coach. Now, the Ravens interviewed Kingsbury, Brady, Nagy, Webb, and Scheelhaase for their head coaching position. Do you think that, Jonas, they could go back to some of those interview notes and say, hey, this guy would actually make a great offensive coordinator under Jesse Minter?
I think it would probably be more likely than not that they make a hire from that group of guys. But obviously, the holdup with that is just, Jesse Minter, is he going to hire someone that he is familiar with? Is he going to be? Can he take a chance on someone who he doesn't really know, but has only heard good things about? Obviously, the Ravens have to be Rooney Rule compliant, so they have to, with any coordinator hire, bring in two external diverse candidates to interview before they can make a hire here. So that is something to just bear in mind as you wonder why the Ravens are taking their time with all this. What John did was, in the Lamar era, he had Greg Roman on staff before he promoted him to offensive coordinator, and obviously it worked pretty well early on before it really got pretty stale and the passing game needed a revamping. And so he brought in Todd Monken, who was the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of familiarity. Like, as we've talked about, all he knew about Todd Monken was that Tom Crean had worked with him or had, cross paths with him at Georgia, and Tom Crean thought really highly of him. And obviously Tom Crean is in the Harbaugh family because he's married to John Harbaugh's sister. So there was that degree of familiarity, but it wasn't like they'd ever shared a staff. And, we see with Mike Mickens, even though they didn't spend a lot of time together, they did have that familiarity with one another from their time together at Cincinnati and at Indiana State. So when you are doing these fantasy football coaching staffs, just a reminder, like, how much does familiarity matter? Will Jesse Minter be filling his staff with guys who the Ravens have some experience with, some familiarity with, either from the coaching staff process, the coaching search process, or will they be open to hiring just guys that maybe Jesse has never really worked with? And is that going to be a sticking point at any point of the situations? Obviously, I think Jesse has shown himself to be open to reinvention and bringing in new ideas and bringing in new guys. That's just part of the deal of where he's gone. But he's also brought a lot of guys that he knows pretty well. Like there was a pretty sizable crew of guys who went for them from Michigan to LA Jim Harbaugh as well, obviously, was the guy who was probably engineering a lot of that. But it's going to be, I think we're going to learn a lot about Jesse and his process and maybe what the Ravens want and the higher ups there as well. When you were talking about, we have this very, very, open window to potentially win a Super Bowl. How much does experience and background and shared backgrounds matter versus how much does this is just a guy who can work well with a lot of people, even if they're complete strangers to him in this coaching world that is a lot of times, pretty incestuous.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could make a case for hiring a veteran play caller. I mean, somebody in the mold of Todd Monken, not Todd Monken, obviously, but somebody like that, somebody who has called plays before at an NFL level. Monken came over to the Ravens from the college ranks, but previously he had been an offensive coordinator in the NFL. You have a first-year head coach in Jesse Minter, so maybe giving him some stability there in a side of the ball that he doesn't specialize in could be helpful, so that you take a lot off his plate. But at the same time, it would be nice to get some fresh ideas in here. If the Ravens maybe missed their opportunity to get a Sean McVay at head coach by going on the defensive side, maybe they could tap into some of these young up-and-comers. I know there's been a vocal portion of the fan base that has been calling for Davis Webb. There obviously are some Nate Shieldhouse fans out there. Jonas, you liked him. So maybe those are two guys who would jump at an opportunity to call plays for Lamar Jackson, get some fresh new ideas in the building, and maybe, spark another jump from this offense. On the defense,
with Webb and Shieldhouse both losing yesterday, there is no hold up for them after the Super Bowl. So, like I said, you have to go through you have to check all the boxes as you're going through the coaching search process. But Davis Webb and Nate Shieldhouse, as soon as the Rooney Rule is satisfied for whatever job there is around the NFL, they could be hired as soon as today. And obviously, the holdup with Webb and Shieldhouse would be one, do they want to leave LA if they don't get a head coaching job? Because obviously they are well thought of right now to be in the mix for head coaching interviews. But number two, also, they are in the mix for head coaching interviews. Like Davis Webb has been connected to the Rams job. He's been connected to the Bills job because of his familiarity with Josh Allen. Shieldhouse seems like a pretty serious contender in Cleveland, especially with Grant Udinski pulling his name out of the mix there to get a raise in Jacksonville and not be subjected to being a head coach of the Browns in his first real, serious shot at that kind of opportunity. So, both those guys could be off the board in a matter of days, or both of them could still be on the board, but not really want to leave the comforts of home and what they are learning from Sean McVay and Sean Payton, respectively. So I don't think Matt Nagy, with all due respect to the Nagy family, is seriously consideration. Obviously, we've seen Cliff Kingsbury connected to the Ravens from even before, we knew that Jesse Minter would be getting the head coaching job here. So Joe Brady is obviously someone whose status is in flux there with whatever is going to happen in Buffalo. But it seems like the Ravens will probably get a guy who is pretty well regarded here. Just a matter of what your appetite is for a Kingsbury or a Brady versus someone who was a little bit less proven, but has very good connections and pedigree because of where they're coming from with LA and Denver and all that good stuff.
Yeah, Diana Rossini reported last week that she said she knows for a fact that Lamar Jackson would like Cliff Kingsbury as their offensive coordinator, but he's still out there. So maybe the Ravens are still open to having somebody else interview or hired there. On the defensive side, Jonas, let's talk about some names that have been connected to Jesse Minter because some guys that he's overlapped with. Defensive backs coach with the Chargers, Steve Clinkscale, is somebody who was mentioned on our last show by Chris Rim. Dylan Rooney, who's the outside linebackers coach for the Chargers. And then around the NFL, some guys that are getting some buzz as future defensive coordinators. Al Harris, the Bears defensive backs coach. Durante Jones, who's the Vikings defensive backs coach and passing game coordinator. Jim Leonard, is it Leonard, who's the Denver assistant head coach and pass game coordinator? And then Anthony Weaver, of course, as the Miami Dolphins head coach who interviewed for the Ravens head coaching job. So those are some names to keep in mind. But the Ravens have already interviewed somebody for their defensive coordinator position, and that's Joe Cullen, 58-year-old Chiefs defensive line coach who also has some experience on the Ravens staff.
Yeah, they worked together for that 2017 to 2020 period that obviously Jesse was here in Baltimore. There is that familiarity. He could be He could have that kind of adults in the room presence because of his familiarity with Baltimore, because of his seniority and his veteran ties to Baltimore. Or you could get it with Anthony Weaver, who obviously is in the mix for a bunch of different head coaching jobs. You hope it's not just because of his diverse background. You hope that he's a serious candidate and not just being kind of used as a puppet for all these Rooney Rule considerations. But I think both those guys would definitely give you something as connective tissue to Baltimore and to playing like a Raven and to all the things that I think do matter for a team and for their culture and for the helping a new head coach. But there are a lot of teams that need defensive coordinators. There are a lot of teams that have opportunities, and the kind of elephant in the room here is how much does coming to a team where you probably will not be the defensive play caller, how much of that is going to be a sticking point? Because I think the expectation is that Jesse, like he's been doing for however many years now, he's been a defensive coordinator, will continue to do that in Baltimore. Like Mike Macdonald, once he got the Seattle Seahawks head coaching job, did not all of a sudden give up that role. He has remained the play caller for Seattle, and lo and behold, it has worked gangbusters. So I think if you are talking about Jesse Minter profiling as the Ravens' next Mike Macdonald, it probably wouldn't make a lot of sense to think that this guy is going to give up what made him so special. So maybe there's a co-defensive coordinator thing. Maybe it becomes a kind of weird nebulous gray area zone, like with Andy Reid in Kansas City, where you have a pretty good sense that Andy Reid is the play caller, but maybe there are some series or some situations where he turns it over to someone else, and that gray area works to the benefit of the guy who is getting head coaching interviews because of it. Like, I think that was the one thing that was always tough to unpack from afar when you talk about a guy like Eric Bieniemy. He is the offensive coordinator, and maybe he gets the opportunity to call plays or to scheme up certain things in certain areas, but you don't really know unless you're in the room with him or unless you're in that on that Chiefs roster. And even then, the guys on the team were never really transparent about who exactly is responsible for in what certain situations. So that's always going to be the thing that I think is probably working against the Ravens in this situation is, are you really going to come up to Baltimore to not call plays? Because
Right.
that is the thing that is going to be most valuable for you in propelling your career to the next step forward. So that should always just something to kind of keep in mind there.
Sure. All right. Before we get on Cody Alexander to talk about the Ravens defense, Jonas, we got to talk about the fact that a name that I've already mentioned on this podcast, Mike McCarthy, has been hired as the next Steelers head coach. Jonas, this was not the way I would have gone about a coaching search if I were the Pittsburgh Steelers. If I was left without Mike Tomlin, the longest tenured head coach in the NFL, I just would not be, one, I wouldn't hire Mike McCarthy, but two, if Mike McCarthy was the best guy at the end of a long thought out process by the Steelers, fine. But the Steelers didn't even wait to interview Chris Shula or Nate Scheelhaus, two guys who are considered up and coming assistants who could have blown them out of the water, who could have interviewed amazingly, who could have commanded the room, who could have been the Mike Tomlin who was not expected to be a head coaching candidate and just interviewed so well 19 years ago and blew the doors off the Pittsburgh brass that he got the head coaching job and then won a Super Bowl a year later. This is just, they interviewed 3 candidates. They interviewed 2 candidates in all likelihood to fulfill the Rooney Rule, for which they are named, or not for which they are named. For which they are named, or for the rule is named for them.
Yeah,
I should say. Yeah, there we go. They were not named after the rule, though. That would be pretty funny. They brought in 2 candidates, and then they brought in Mike McCarthy, and they hired Mike McCarthy. Crazy.
It's because we don't know what Jesse Minter is going to be next year. Like, it would not be surprising if there is like a list of head coaching strength by division, and the Ravens are not, and the AFC North is near the bottom, because sure, Jesse Minter could have a Mike Macdonald like Mike Vrabel like transformative effect. But you were talking about a potential lame duck coach in Zach Taylor, who's the only guy who is retained from last year. The options in Cleveland are not inspiring, and probably is going to be a 1 or 2 year experiment there before they bring in the next guy to coach whoever they take with the next top ranked quarterback that they're taking after what will probably be a very what might be a bottoming out 2026 experience. And then you're talking about Mike McCarthy, who I think Connor Orr for Sports Illustrated made a somewhat compelling argument for how the Steelers hiring Mike McCarthy is not all that different from Denver hiring Sean Payton or trading for Sean Payton the way that they did, because they both had and do have pretty extensively compelling profiles as offensive coaches. But it's a little bit different for Pittsburgh hiring Mike McCarthy and saying, look at what he did with Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb and a usually pretty talented and pretty healthy Cowboys offensive line versus Sean Payton, who was, I think, making the most of whatever he had at the end of his tenure there in New Orleans with the Saints. Because I think anyone could have made that Cowboys offense a top 5 offense the way that things were rolling there. And if you are only hiring Mike McCarthy, not only, but if one of the reasons that you were hiring Mike McCarthy is to make Aaron Rodgers more amenable to coming
Insane.
back.
That just
I think that is not
your
a good strategy. That's not a good process. And certainly,
specious
if you are bringing back, if you're bringing back Aaron Rodgers because you can point to look at what he did against the Ravens, well, there are a lot of guys who made that Ravens defense look like the bad unit that it was. Malik Willis had the day of his damn life against Zach Orr and that Ravens defense. So it just seems like you are basically hiring a guy to give you the same narrow window for a playoff breakthrough as Mike Tomlin. And obviously there are considerations in play here that don't really matter as much to us as they might to the Steelers front office, which is Mike McCarthy is a Pittsburgh guy. Mike McCarthy does have connections to that front office that would make for a more manageable day-to-day existence, a more collaborative approach than if you're bringing in someone else that you don't really know that well. But man, it is not going to move tickets the way that a Shieldhouse or a Webb or a Shula might have been able to, just because of the fact that you are possibly talking yourself into the idea that this guy could be the next great thing, the best thing since sliced bread, when we kind of have an idea of what Mike McCarthy is and what Mike McCarthy isn't. And what Mike McCarthy was this past coaching cycle was a guy who was not very coveted outside Pittsburgh's front office, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, if they just hired Mike McCarthy because he's from Pittsburgh, I mean, that's the same reasoning as drafting Kenny Pickett because he played at Pitt.
That's why you hire like a college football coach. That's not why you hire an NFL coaching. Like, a recruiting footprint does not matter in the NFL.
Right. And I don't want to make it seem like Mike McCarthy's an awful head coach. Like he's won a Super Bowl. He's had a lot of regular season success. I mean, he had 3 seasons in back-to-back 12-win seasons in Dallas before things went awry. So there's a good chance the Ravens are facing Mike McCarthy twice next year and they lose both games. Like he's a good regular season coach and he has won a Super Bowl before. But just if I were a Ravens fan, I would be glad that the Ravens didn't go this route. I mean, hiring a retread is fine. I'm not going to say that any team that, there's a retread in the Super Bowl right now, but to go with Mike McCarthy after this and to just not open yourself up to outside candidates, not to really like give anybody else a real shot, is just not how I would be approaching this at all. Well, it's just going to be fascinating to watch. All right. Well, let's talk about the guy that the Ravens hired, Jesse Minter. Jonas, you wrote a great story on thebanner.com where people can subscribe $1 for 6 months about what Jesse Minter brings to a defense, to the Ravens defense, and what he did in LA. Some fascinating nuggets there. A lot of stuff about how the Chargers don't blitz a whole lot, but they didn't really need to after acquiring Odafe Owe. How a lot of his defenses have been able to stop Patrick Mahomes in ways that the Ravens defense has not been able to do, and stop star quarterbacks in general, which is something the Ravens defense has struggled with. He's a great tendency breaker. He sets one thing up, and then the last half of the season just totally abandons it and goes with something else to keep teams on their toes. The simulated pressures and creepers, this is something we heard a lot about from Mike Macdonald when he was the defensive coordinator. All kinds of wrinkles that are staples of a Jesse Minter defense that could just open all kinds of doors for this Ravens defense.
Yeah, and as we're going to talk about with Cody, it's not going to be that drastic of a difference from Zach Orr because they come from the same background. They have the same kind of priorities, the same kind of values. It's just a matter of how well do you teach it? What are you willing to sacrifice? What do you value more in a certain quarter, in a certain game, in a certain part of your defense? There are a lot of things that you can learn from Jesse Minter. There are a lot of things that I think the Ravens tried with Zach Orr that are probably going to be similar to what Jesse brings to Baltimore. Just a matter of execution, and can he relate to guys? Can he bring a fresh approach that was that had maybe gotten a little bit stale in the Mike Macdonald to Zach Orr transition? So I do think probably the biggest thing that caught my eye was just how well he had done against Patrick Mahomes. Like, we have seen really good defensive coordinators in Baltimore not be able to figure things out against Patrick Mahomes and that Chiefs offense. Like, Wink Martindale couldn't do it. Zach Orr couldn't do it. Mike Macdonald did a good job in that AFC Championship game, but on the whole, it was not really it has not really been a tradition in Baltimore that we are going to play Patrick Mahomes and make him look like the average version of Patrick Mahomes. You always got the guy who was going to raise his game, and your defense, meanwhile, could not. So who knows if Patrick Mahomes is even the big bad wolf in the AFC right now, but I think it is at least encouraging that that Chargers team, considering the familiarity of the AFC West, considering just how often the Ravens saw Patrick Mahomes because of how often you got those first place matchups with the NFL scheduling deadlines. I think it is just a good sign that the Ravens got a guy who has proof of concept with figuring out a quarterback who is going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer, might still be the best quarterback in the NFL. And they just found ways to frustrate him in ways that the Ravens could not, and ways that a lot of NFL teams just could not.
Yeah. Well, let's get Cody Alexander's perspective on the other side of another quick break.
For the 5th year in a row, Toyota is the best resale value brand according to Kelley Blue Book's KBB.com, including the 2025 Grand Highlander, best in resale value for midsize SUVs. Toyota, let's go places.
And now we're joined on the Banner Ravens podcast by Cody Alexander. He's at _coach_A on X. His Substack is MatchQuarters, has over 26,000 subscribers. He's also the host of the Let's Talk Ball podcast. We've had Cody on this show in the past. The last time we had him on was Halloween 2024. The Ravens had just traded for Deontay Johnson, and I remember saying, the Ravens don't really need Deontay Johnson, but he'll be nice to have. He'll come in handy at some point, maybe in a playoff game. That wasn't the case. So let's hope that our conversation about Jesse Minter will be better predictive of what is to come for the Ravens than that podcast was.
Yeah, appreciate you guys having me on.
So let's start with what went wrong for this Ravens defense, because you analyze this from every angle, and plenty went wrong for the Ravens defense in 2025. They sunk so many assets into the defense. They weren't near the top in terms of spending, but they had multiple guys with $100 million contracts, of course. They had spent so many resources, 10 day 1 and day 2 picks on defense in the last 5 drafts. So the talent was certainly there. But in your eyes, Cody, what went wrong for this Ravens defense? Was it Zach Orr? Was it Nnamdi Madubuike going down in week 3? Was it the lack of pass rush? What went wrong?
Well, I think starting off with Madubuike, that's the big thing here. Looking at it, though, the run defense really was not the problem. It was really the secondary. And I think it all started with Washington getting hurt in the preseason. This was a defense that was really going to lean into having 3 safeties on the field. If you think about it, this is the same family and this is the same tree as Seattle. And now we'll talk about Jesse Minter here in a second, but what are the common denominators in both of those defense? Eamon Worry, we saw how effective he was last night against the Rams. And then you look at Derwin James, who's an absolute alien and kind of that slot defender that you need right now in modern football. So this is a kind of that go-between that's been a problem with the Ravens, is the Kyle Hamilton and the need to put him at the slot. But the problem is when we move him there, we don't have anybody in the back end. Now, this is a primarily middle of the field closed structure, meaning that they're going to have a free safety in the post in the middle of the field. They want to play cover 3 and cover 1. And that's really where the lack of matchups is. The corners, I think you saw it with like Humphrey kind of fell off a little bit this year. The corners were constantly at odds. Anytime you go single high, whether it's cover 3 or whether it's cover 1, you're getting isolated matchups on the outside. And I think that was a big factor for the Ravens this year.
Cody, on that note, you look at what the Chargers did last year defensively, and they were a top 10 defense despite not having an overwhelming run defense. I think the past 2 years, they've been pretty middle of the road in DVOA. But obviously, that was, I think, a philosophical choice. They did not play a lot of middle field close. There was a lot of too high structures before the snap. Do you think that we will see that like poured over to the Ravens? And do you think that maybe Jesse will be more willing to deal with games where it's 4 yards per carry allowed, 5 yards per carry allowed, more willing than Zach Orr was, because he knows that we just want to be this bend but don't break defense, even if it looks ugly on the run defense stat sheet.
Yeah, I actually think that, again, I think where he is philosophically aligned with Mike Macdonald, and they get lumped together because of the Ravens tree background. They both were at Michigan. You could even argue, and I've said this before, you can argue that Minter actually had the better defense at Michigan. But they want to basically be 50-50. I mean, that's really what they want to be, because if you can run everything from a 2-high shell and make everything look the exact same, it's very much the Fangio. It's very interesting. The Fangio adjacent teams are all trying to do the same thing as these. I call it the Ravens 2.0. It's basically Mike Macdonald came in, he cleaned up the Wink Martindale structure and system, kind of siloed everything together, made it more intuitive, made it more player focused. Now he calls it a modular defense, because now they can steal from different things and make it more game plan specific without actually breaking the players' brains every week. Minter is very much in that mold. And the reason why you want to be 50-50 is because I want it to be a statistical coin flip every single time that you come to the ball. You have no idea what we're going to run. We can run cover 3. We can run any of our split field coverages. We can run man coverage out of a 2-high shell. You talk about that in the Fangio system all the time about how, now the modern defense, everybody used to look at the weak safety. Now they have to start looking at the nickel leverage. And then, so you're moving guys' eyes around. So what I think when he takes this job, it's going to be, how can we get Kyle Hamilton near the box? And then how can we make everything look absolutely the same from a down-to-down pre-snap picture?
I think the comparison between Kyle Hamilton and Derwin James is a fascinating one, because you mentioned Derwin James being kind of an alien, somebody who can do it all, who can play free safety, who can line up near the line of scrimmage, who can be in the box. Kyle Hamilton has been that for the Ravens the past several years. And, when they moved him to free safety at the end of the 2024 season, they weren't really fully utilizing his abilities. And we saw him used way more in kind of the jack of all trades role this past year. How easy of a transition is it going to be? And how much of the principles that Jesse Minter used with Derwin James do you think he can then bring to what he will do with Kyle Hamilton on the Ravens?
I mean, I really look at them as almost the same player, in a sense that they pretty much have the same kind of DNA in terms of what they are as a player. They want to be close to the box. If you need them in deep coverage on a passing down, you can move him there. You can use him as more of a leveraging tool and move him around. I think it's a lot easier too, especially now as we're getting more and more 12 personnel and 13 personnel on early downs. But the twist here is that they're trying to actually pass the ball. So you want to live in nickel. I think it's so funny that as more things change, the more they stay the same. So as further away from like the spread era that we had from 18 to probably about 22, that is further we get away from that, defenses are still trying to figure out ways that they can just live in nickel. Like, because if we can live in nickel, it takes everything away. And the engine of the modern offense is the passing game. There's a reason why quarterbacks are paid $60 million. It's not to hand the ball off to a $10 million running back. That's inefficient, right? And so I think that's the conundrum, is because at the end of the day, you still have to stop the run, because the run is what's going to get, that's the gas, right? So you can have a really nice car of it. If you don't have that gas in there, it's going to die. And if you're only passing, you're going to eventually die. You have no game control. You get into predictable places. Now these pass rushes and blitzes and all this stuff, coverage rotations, now it's basically turned into a quarterback centric world. And so I think that's the big conundrum for defenses, is I have to be able to stop the run, but I need to stay in nickel as much as I can. And if I can even be in dime, that's even better. And that's another place where the Chargers were one of the top in the league.
Cody, do you think that, you write in the breakdown of the Chargers defense, you were kind of leveraging, Jesse Minter was leveraging the inefficiency of the run game against offenses based on how he presented personnel and formation. But, this was a Chargers front that had a lot of really good run stuffers. And I think one of the frustration of Ravens fans is just how much certain guys played or how much they didn't play at all. And I think a lot of the commonalities were there among those guys, were that they didn't really defend the run that well. Like, Aeneas Peebles doesn't have great size. Adafe Owe wasn't really a willing run defender when he was in Baltimore this past season. So are there certain things that, from the 10,000 foot view that you took of the Chargers defense, that are kind of non-negotiables for guys who are getting early down snaps?
Yeah, you're going to have solid edges. And I think that's the key. It's really interesting to me too, to really look at this. And I'm going to go back to Seattle because they're playing in the Super Bowl, but also it's the same family, and it will have a direct correlation onto what's going to be tried in Baltimore. Those defensive ends, though they may be, quote unquote edges or hybrid outside linebackers, they have to be sturdy. I think you saw Minter, and then you also saw Macdonald make more of a move to where, hey, look, we can kind of have one hybrid on the field, but we've got to have another guy on the other side that is just going to be able to hold up against these wide zone runs. They're going to be able to hold up against the tight end. DeMarcus Lawrence, people forget because all the focus in Dallas was on Micah Parsons, but DeMarcus Lawrence was the run stopping defensive end. And so you see that's where what we get in Seattle is where DeMarcus Lawrence is really kind of the guy that if you need to leave him by himself, he can handle it. And so then you look at what the Chargers were able to do with Khalil Mack. It was kind of the same way. Or you get two defensive ends. So even though you are a 3-4 in spirit and in base personnel, when you install it, right, or when you have to make a depth chart, at the end of the day, you're trying to stay in nickel. You're trying to get into these 4-down fronts. Wide 9 is still a big deal, meaning that these defensive ends are really wide. But now we're able to have the ability to kind of crash them in and to create different scenarios towards a tight end and at the point of attack. The Ravens defense wasn't terrible. And so I think like with some of the moves you mentioned of like getting rid of Owe and then some other things that they were able to do structurally, the bones are there. It's the secondary that really needs to get fixed. And I think that's where Minter really has excelled, because at Charger secondary, there's really not, outside of Derwin James, there's not a lot of guys that you're just like beating the door down to have on your team.
I think that secondary is fascinating because the Ravens, they obviously have the high price guys there in Kyle Hamilton and Marlon Humphrey, assuming he's going to be around next season, but they have 2 first-round picks in the past 2 years in Nate Wiggins and Malachi Starks, who have shown flashes, but they need to be able to be consistent for this whole thing to work. Do you feel like those are 2 guys that could maybe take a leap with Jesse Minter as their head coach?
Yes, and I also think having Alohi Gilman already on the team that's going to almost easy button. Like, hey, I already know what the expectation is. I know what it's going to be. I like Malachi Starks. I liked him when he came out. Again, I think it was one of those things where he was going to be the third safety. It ended up he had to play early. And so it kind of threw a loop into that. Safety play, a lot of times too, deep safety play we've seen takes a couple of years. That second year is really when they come into their own, when they're not playing nickel. Typically, if they play nickel and they're a nickel guy, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that guy's really good. And then second year is when they become like an all-pro or a pro bowler. Nate Wiggins, to me, is really interesting. Elite athlete, can play man coverage, gets a little handsy sometimes, will get beat sometimes. I do think that he's still young. He's still developing. The jury's still kind of out on, is he going to end up being a pro bowler? Is he going to be elite? I think that, you have a solid mix there. That you can kick in Marlon Humphrey. I like the TJ Tampa kid. I think that he's eventually going to then develop as well. So there's pieces there. And I think with what the production was for the Chargers at the secondary level, I think is a good thing because you're coming into a younger secondary. You need that developmental piece. And I think Minter will really be able to do that.
Cody, last couple questions for you. I think obviously, there is confidence in this secondary getting back to at least a, league average level, if not well above. But I think there's all eyes are on this pass rush and what it can do. And, there was a lot of resources poured into that group up front with drafting Mike Green, put the 5th-year option on Owe, obviously Madubuike leaving, getting hurt, put a huge damper on what this group could do. But, from following you on X and reading your stuff, like the Ravens did creative things with their pass rush, but you didn't really have that alpha that could kind of tilt the game plan in your favor. You didn't really have a lot of guys who could win one-on-ones reliably. So how much do you think Minter can realistically raise the floor and the ceiling of this team? And how much of it is just going to depend on guys getting better on a skill level to really, punish teams that aren't afraid to chip or aren't afraid to double team, depending on what the matchups are?
Yeah, that's gonna be the secret sauce here. I think one of the things, and here's what, if I'm a Ravens fan, I'm looking at, okay, Wink Martindale was blitzing a lot. We were playing a lot of man coverage. Macdonald comes in, we lead the NFL in sacks. Okay. I'm looking at the Seahawks and I'm like, okay, well, I want that. They don't have, they have 2 really good interior guys. I feel like we have interior guys here in Baltimore. They don't have these high priced defensive ends. They're still getting a lot of pressure. How can we manufacture that? Minter comes from the same tree. I think it's going to be one of those where he's going to have to figure that out as well. Low blitz rate, not a lot of middle of the road pressure, high stunt rate. I think the players that he's going to have at the Ravens is going to be a little bit more dynamic, especially on the inside. Really there were times where the reason why they're not getting a ton of pressure at the Chargers is not because of the defensive ends. It's because of the interior. I mean, a lot of times he's playing with 2 noses so that it's essentially like we're just trying to waste 3. So I think that there is the ability with Minter coming in to raise that floor and to maybe eventually push the ceiling on where that pressure can be, just because I think it's going to be more functional up front. I think you're also going to see him be a little bit more dynamic with who they're using. Again, this is not a defense that is going to want to blitz a ton. I think you're going to see less, a lot of times too, I think you're going to see less man usage than you did this year. Again, I go back to cover 3 and cover 1, high usage, not a lot of production out of it. Right. And a lot of quick throws, a lot of quarterbacks getting off of, being able to get the ball out early. That affects your pressure rates. And so I think going more back to zone, being more intuitive with how we're moving the front, having more dynamic guys on the inside, I think will help you get that pressure rate back up.
Cody, you study college football as well, and the Ravens made their first hire to Jesse Minter's staff. That's Mike Mickens, who was the defensive backs coach at Notre Dame, overlapped with Kyle Hamilton there, and he's reportedly being hired as the Ravens defensive backs coach and defensive pass game coordinator. Do you have any thoughts on the addition of Mike Mickens?
It is interesting because here I am, and I just told you, I don't think they're going to play a ton of
a lot of cover 1 at Notre Dame.
And then it's all cover 1. I do think, though, and my suspicion on this is that it's a lot of match coverage anyway. Match is just a fancy word for man with rules. I think you're going to see there's been a lot of talent developed in that secondary with Notre Dame. There's several guys that are playing pretty well that came from that Notre Dame system, and especially at safety. I think they feel comfortable with the corners they have, but I need somebody that can really get in that safety room and clean it up. Well, you have Xavier Watts, who I think people are looking at like, how did this guy fall as far as he did for the Falcons? He's a Notre Dame guy. You have Kyle Hamilton, who obviously is going to have some sort of a relationship with him as well. He's going to be in that safety room. I think to me, when you start digging into it, it makes a lot more sense having him come in. I also think too, Minter takes a more collegiate approach towards what we're trying to do defensively than necessarily like just, hey, we're in the NFL, we're going to win with this matchup here. It's more of a mitigating style of defense of where we're just trying to take the air out, trying to make you drive, not make mistakes, which again, I think is more of a collegiate style or a philosophy of way of looking at it, which makes sense because Minter spent a lot more time at the college level. So I like it. He's a proven developer of defensive backs. Like I said, those defensive backs in Notre Dame have been pretty good. I don't think, though, that means like, oh, okay, I guess we're going to look like Jim Schwartz out there in the Cleveland Browns running like man covers 50% of the time.
Awesome. Cody Alexander lending his thoughts about the Ravens defense and what it could look like under Jesse Minter. He's at @the_coach_A. His Substack is MatchQuarters, and he's the host of the Let's Talk Ball podcast. Cody, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.